My father-in-law and mother-in-law wanted to break up my marriage, but it turned against them. My name is Alex, and the story I'm about to tell is one that started 8 years ago, full of hope and youthful dreams, and ended only recently in a heated, heart-pounding argument that finally set things right. It began with Emily, the love of my life, whose warm smile could make a bad day better with just a glance. Meeting her felt like the universe aligning just for me. But what I didn't know was that loving her would mean navigating the sharp edges of her family's expectations, where wealth, status, and power were the language they spoke fluently. Emily and I first crossed paths at a charity event hosted by a mutual friend. She was captivating, her laughter carrying across the room, drawing eyes like moths to a flame. I was there in my only decent suit, a hand-me-down from my father that still had the faint scent of his cologne. Emily noticed me struggling to balance a plate of hors d'oeuvres and a glass of champagne, and with a smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes, she came over. "Need a hand?" she asked, her voice light but steady. "Oh, just trying to pretend I'm more graceful than I actually am," I joked, almost dropping the glass as I spoke. She laughed, a genuine sound that softened the formal air around us. "Don't worry, you're doing just fine," she said, her eyes meeting mine. That was it. That was the beginning. We started dating soon after. I was in sales back then, working tirelessly at a mid-sized tech company, juggling quotas and cold calls, but I found time for Emily. I took her on picnics at the park, late-night drives through quiet roads, and on winter afternoons, we'd share hot cocoa at my mother's coffee shop, listening to the stories of regulars who seemed to have known each other forever. My parents adored her. My mother, apron dusted with flour, would whisper to me after Emily left, "That girl's a keeper, Alex. You can tell she's got a good heart." But my welcome was not as warm when Emily brought me to her parents' home for the first time. Their house stood at the end of a gated drive, windows tall and wide, gleaming in the glow of the sunset like eyes that had seen too much. Richard, her father, greeted us at the door in a crisp, tailored suit even though it was a Sunday. He gave me a firm handshake that lingered a moment too long, as if he were weighing me, measuring the depth of my ambition. "So, Alex," he started as we moved into the grand sitting room, walls adorned with art that probably cost more than my car. "Emily tells me you work in sales?" "Yes, sir," I replied, trying to keep my voice even. "Tech sales, actually." "Interesting," Richard said, not quite smiling. He exchanged a glance with Linda, his wife, who sat across the room, draped in a silk blouse and pearls. She sipped her wine, the thin stem of the glass twisting between her fingers as her eyes flickered between me and Emily. "Sales can be competitive," Linda said, each word punctuated as if she were ticking off a list. "Not a stable path for the long run," Emily interjected, her hand brushing mine for reassurance. "Alex is amazing at what he does, Mom. He's one of the best in his company." I felt a rush of warmth at her defense, but it only sharpened the judgment in Richard's stare. "Ambition is commendable," Richard continued, leaning back and folding his hands together. "But ambition without a safety net can be risky." The unspoken implication hung in the air, making the room feel colder despite the marble fireplace crackling at the far end. I swallowed, keeping my smile intact. This wasn't just a conversation. It was an interrogation. "Yes, but I'm ready for whatever comes next," I said, trying to match Richard's confidence. He raised an eyebrow, intrigued but not impressed. Dinner was a series of subtle challenges, questions wrapped in polite tones that poked at my future, my finances, and my intentions with Emily. When the dessert plates were cleared, I found myself outside with Richard on the balcony, overlooking the manicured lawn under a sky now sprinkled with stars. "She's special, you know," he said, breaking the silence as he took a sip from his glass. "My daughter deserves everything in the world." "I know," I replied softly, "and I'll do whatever it takes to make sure she's happy." Richard nodded slowly, turning to face me fully. "I hope so, Alex, because in our world, promises alone won't be enough." The challenge was laid out, and I knew then that marrying Emily wouldn't just be about love. It would be about proving myself in a world that had already decided I wasn't worthy. The monotony of my sales job started gnawing at me after a year of dating Emily. Each day felt like a loop of cold calls, rejections, and late-night exhaustion. I wanted more for myself and for us. One evening, sitting across from Emily in my parents' cozy coffee shop, I confessed my ambition. "I think I need to start my own business," I said, my voice tentative, fingers drumming the chipped wooden table. The shop was quiet, save for the clinking of mugs and my mom chatting with a regular by the counter. Emily set her cup down and leaned in, eyes wide with interest. "Really?" she asked, a smile creeping onto her lips. "It's risky, I added quickly. "We might struggle for a while. It won't be easy." I braced for hesitation, for that flicker of doubt that her parents had mastered. But Emily's expression softened into something unwavering. "Alex, I know you can do this," she said. "We'll find a way, together." Her certainty anchored me. Within weeks, I quit my job and plunged headfirst into launching my electronics business. The adrenaline kept me afloat, but soon reality hit like a tidal wave. Sales were unpredictable, expenses piled up, and there were nights I stared at spreadsheets with a sinking heart. The financial strain grew. We adjusted our lives, fewer dinners out, budgeting down to the cent. But it wasn't enough to silence the doubts from Emily's parents. During a dinner at their house, Richard leaned back in his chair and eyed me with that same disapproving glint. "How's the new venture treating you, Alex?" The question was innocent on the surface, but the room stilled. Even Linda paused, fork hovering midair, waiting for my answer. "It's challenging," I admitted, keeping my tone steady. "But it's coming together." Richard nodded slowly, his lips pursing as he shared a glance with Linda. "I see. Well, ambition is good. Just make sure Emily doesn't have to bear the weight of it." I clenched my jaw, the subtle jab tightening my chest. They believed she was supporting me out of sheer obligation, not love. It stung, but Emily squeezed my hand under the table, a silent reminder that we were a team. Even as the business faltered, she reassured me with the same words, "We'll find a way." Despite her parents' doubts, their pointed looks, and whispered conversations about my recklessness, Emily's faith never wavered. For her, I would weather it all. As months turned into years, the business teetered on the brink of success and collapsed more times than I could count. I pulled all-nighters, drank too much coffee, and sacrificed time with Emily to keep pushing forward. But even as I fought to build our future, Richard and Linda's doubts were constant, looming shadows. Family gatherings became a battleground of subtle digs. One summer evening, we were at Emily's parents' house for her mother's birthday. The backyard was set up with twinkling lights and catered dishes. Everything perfectly arranged, much like the image Linda curated for her life. "Alex," Richard called out as I passed him, balancing a plate. "How's the venture holding up? I heard tech can be fickle." He sipped his scotch, eyes gleaming with a challenge. "It's holding up," I said, forcing a smile. "There are ups and downs, but we're getting there." Linda tilted her head, her voice lilting as she added, "Emily mentioned she's been working longer hours at the firm. I'm glad she has that stability." Her eyes were kind, but the words cut deeper than I let on. I glanced at Emily, who stiffened, fingers clenching her drink. Later that night, as we drove home in silence, Emily reached for my hand. "Don't let them get to you, Alex. They don't understand what it takes to build something from the ground up." I squeezed her hand, grateful for her unwavering support, but unable to shake the frustration. It wasn't just the criticism. It was the underlying message that I wasn't enough, that she deserved someone safer, someone established. The unspoken comparisons lingered like a bitter aftertaste. But my determination hardened. Each glance, each loaded question, only added fuel. If I could just prove them wrong, show them that I could provide Emily with the life she deserved, it would all be worth it. 2 years later, I stood on a windswept hill overlooking the park where Emily and I had spent countless afternoons. It was autumn, and the leaves were painted in shades of gold and crimson, swirling in the breeze. My palms were sweaty as I held the ring box, my heart thundering with a mix of excitement and nerves. When Emily met me there, her eyes sparkled with curiosity. "What's all this?" she asked, her smile teasing. I took her hands in mine, the chill of the air forgotten as I dropped to one knee. Emily, you've been my rock, my inspiration, and the reason I believe in myself when no one else does. I began, my voice steadying as I saw tears well up in her eyes. Will you marry me? Yes, she whispered, pulling me up into a kiss as the wind rustled around us, nature's applause. The following weeks were a whirlwind of planning and celebration, until Richard and Linda called me over for a talk. I arrived at their house, greeted by the cold echo of their polished foyer. Richard gestured for me to sit, his expression serious. Linda perched on the edge of the couch, her arms folded tightly. We're happy for you both, Richard began, though his tone was stiff. But before this marriage happens, there is one condition. I frowned, a chill running through me. Condition? Richard slid a thick packet of papers across the glass table. A prenuptial agreement, he stated, to protect Emily's interests and ours. It ensures that, in the event of a divorce, any assets remain separate, and any financial support we've given must be reimbursed. I swallowed hard, staring at the document. The words blurred as anger flared in my chest. It wasn't just a request. It was a declaration that they didn't trust me, that they expected me to fail. But I glanced up at Richard and Linda, their faces etched with firm resolve, and then thought of Emily. I'll sign it, I said finally, the decision burning in my throat. If it means we can move forward, I'll do it. Emily found out later that evening when I handed her the papers. She stared at them in disbelief before looking up at me, her face a mix of anger and sorrow. You deserve better than this, she said, voice shaking. We deserve a chance to start our life without them holding it over us, I replied. Her eyes softened, and she wrapped her arms around me. We signed it, a silent agreement that love was worth more than pride, even if it meant bowing to their conditions. The ink on that paper was a promise. I'd prove them wrong, no matter how long it took. The months leading up to our wedding were tense. I threw myself into work, determined to grow the business enough that no one could question my worth. Emily handled wedding plans while juggling her demanding job at the law firm, and between late nights at the office and calls from vendors, we barely had time to breathe. Still, the glow in her eyes when we talked about our future kept me going. On a crisp spring afternoon, I sat in the tiny office of my workshop, surrounded by boxes of inventory and notes scrawled with half-formed ideas. My phone buzzed with a message from Emily. Need to talk later. Mom and Dad are pushing for changes to the guest list. A knot tightened in my stomach. I could imagine Richard insisting on high-profile business contacts or Linda vetoing my childhood friends. To them, this wasn't just a wedding. It was an extension of their influence, another stage on which they could prove their daughter's life was perfect. That evening, Emily met me at home, exhaustion evident in the slope of her shoulders. We sat on the living room couch, the silence stretching between us until she spoke. They want us to invite some of Dad's partners and a couple of politicians they're close with. I told them no, she said, rubbing her temples. I let out a long breath, frustration simmering beneath my skin. Emily, when does it stop? The prenuptial agreement, their constant meddling. When do we get to make decisions for ourselves? She looked at me, eyes filled with both love and guilt. I'm trying, Alex, but they're relentless. You know they think this wedding is a statement, not just about us, but about them too. I reach for her hand, grounding both of us. Let's make it ours, no matter what they say. We've already signed the papers they wanted. This, at least, should be ours. A small, grateful smile appeared on her face, and she leaned into me. That night, we drafted a guest list that included people who mattered to us. Friends who had supported us, my parents who had believed in us even when things were tough, and her colleagues who knew her as more than just Richard and Linda's daughter. The pushback came swiftly. Richard called, his voice tight with controlled anger. Emily tells me you've decided to limit the guest list. Are you trying to make a statement, Alex? Only that this is our wedding, I said, my voice steady. Richard paused, the silence humming like a warning. I hope you understand the consequences of defying us, he said coldly before ending the call. But this time, I didn't feel the old sting of doubt. Instead, I felt a spark of something more powerful, resolve. The first year of our marriage was a balancing act of newlywed bliss and constant battles with the expectations surrounding us. But as the months rolled by, something began to shift. Orders for my electronics products multiplied, and word spread in the tech community about my innovative designs. The small workshop I'd poured my soul into transformed into a bustling enterprise. My calendar filled with meetings, partnerships, and conferences, and for the first time, we weren't scraping by or worrying about the next payment. One night, Emily and I stood in our kitchen, takeaway containers spread out as we celebrated the latest contract that had just doubled my revenue. She was still in her work clothes, her blazer draped over a chair and her sleeves rolled up, eyes glowing with pride as we toasted with mismatched wine glasses. "To you," she said, leaning in, "for proving everyone wrong, even when they tried their hardest to doubt you." "To us," I corrected, clinking my glass against hers. The joy in that moment was more than just personal success. It was a shared victory over every silent judgment and subtle insult. Even Richard and Linda could no longer ignore my progress. During family gatherings, the tone had shifted. Richard's questions about my business turned from thinly veiled critiques to something approaching genuine curiosity. "I hear your company just closed a deal with that firm in Silicon Valley," Richard remarked during Thanksgiving, eyes narrowing as he studied me. "Quite impressive, Alex." "It's going well," I said, catching Emily's knowing smile from across the table. She mouthed, "Told you so." Linda even chimed in, less frosty than usual. "Emily mentioned how proud she is of you," she said, her voice softened by something that could almost pass for sincerity. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe that maybe we were turning a corner, that the years of pushing forward were finally earning me more than just grudging acknowledgement. Then came the dinner that shifted everything. We were seated in their opulent dining room, chandeliers casting a golden glow that gleamed off the silverware. Richard cleared his throat, the room quieting as he leaned forward. "We've been thinking," he said, folding his hands together, "that it's time to nullify that prenuptial agreement. It's clear now that you've more than proven yourself." The words were a calculated surrender, but they felt more like an insult. Emily's eyes darted to mine, wide with surprise. I took a measured breath, my voice calm but sharp with restrained sarcasm. "No, Richard, I don't think that's necessary. The contract was to reassure you, wasn't it? It's only fair you keep that comfort." The silence was thick as his smile faltered. For the first time, the power shifted in the room, and they knew it. The silence that followed my response was heavy, as if the very air in the room had frozen in place. Richard's forced smile dropped, replaced by a tight-lipped expression. Linda's brows knitted, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face. The glow of the chandelier seemed to dim as tension thickened around the table. "Alex, this isn't a game," Richard said, his voice low and clipped. "We're offering to amend things. That's a sign of respect." I leaned back in my chair, feeling a surge of defiance. For years, they had held their power over me like a trophy, a constant reminder that in their eyes, I was a risk they tolerated for Emily's sake. This sudden offer wasn't respect. It was a way to rewrite history without admitting they had been wrong. "I appreciate the gesture," I said, my tone carefully controlled, "but we don't need to change anything. The contract was meant to protect your interests, and it should stay that way." Emily reached for my hand under the table, her fingers warm against mine. Her eyes met mine with a mixture of pride and empathy, as if she knew how much strength it took to stand my ground. Linda's mask of politeness slipped. "You're being unreasonable, Alex. We're trying to bridge a gap here. You should respect our decision. We're older, more experienced," she said, her voice rising. "Respect?" The word fell from my mouth with a bitter taste. "You demanded that contract to put me in my place, to make sure I knew my worth was conditional. Now that the scales have tipped, you think we can just erase that?" Richard's fist clenched subtly on the table, the veins on his hand prominent. "You forget that we supported Emily when times were hard. Without that, who knows where you'd be now?" Anger coiled in my chest. "You supported Emily, not me. I had my savings, and we would have managed. Your help wasn't a lifeline. It was a leash," I said, my voice unsteady but resolute. Linda opened her mouth to retort, But Emily cut her off, her voice firm. Enough. This conversation is over. If you can't accept my husband for who he is and respect our choices, then we have nothing more to discuss. Richard's eyes narrowed, and the room seemed to shrink as the weight of her words settled. The battle lines had been drawn, but this time, we weren't the ones retreating. The evening ended with barely a word as we left, the slam of the front door echoing in the crisp night air. In the car, I exhaled, the adrenaline slowly draining from my system. Emily turned to me, her eyes fierce. "I'm proud of you, Alex," she whispered, and I felt the final barrier between us and their approval fall away, crumbling into something that no longer mattered. The days after that dinner were filled with a tense silence, punctuated only by the occasional call from Richard or Linda that Emily refused to answer. The fallout was swift and sharp. Rumors among her extended family spread quickly, stories twisted into versions where I was painted as ungrateful or arrogant. Emily's parents reached out to her, attempting to sway her without directly confronting me again. It came to a head one evening when I returned home from work to find Emily sitting at the kitchen table, her phone in front of her, screen lit up with unread messages. She looked up as I entered, exhaustion written in the lines of her face. "They've been relentless," she said, pushing the phone toward me. I scrolled through the messages, apologies wrapped in accusations, suggestions that Emily should reconsider the marriage and put her parents' wishes first. I set the phone down, running a hand through my hair. "They don't stop, do they?" I muttered, frustration boiling just beneath my skin. Emily sighed and stood, wrapping her arms around me. "They won't change, Alex. But I won't either," she said, her voice steady. "I choose us." That night, they took their efforts a step further. There was a knock at the door, and we exchanged a glance. Opening it, I found Richard and Linda standing there, their expressions serious. Without waiting for an invitation, they stepped inside, brushing past me into the living room. Emily followed, crossing her arms tightly. "We need to talk," Richard started, his voice heavy with insistence. "This family is being torn apart, and we need to fix it." "I think we're past that," Emily said, her tone cool. "We try to meet you halfway for years, but it's never enough. Is it?" Linda stepped forward, eyes sharp. "Emily, you're turning your back on us, on the people who raised you. Do you really think this is worth it?" She nodded toward me, her voice laced with disdain. The tension in the room was electric. I fought to keep my composure as Emily's jaw clenched. "If you're here to make me choose between Alex and my family, you've already lost," she said. "We're done letting you control our lives." Richard's face reddened, his calm unraveling. "You don't understand what you're doing," he spat, turning to me. "We try to give you a chance, and this is how you repay us?" I met his gaze, a steadiness in my chest that hadn't been there before. "We don't need your approval, Richard. We never did." Linda's voice cracked as she shouted, "Ungrateful. Both of you." The words hung in the air, sharp and bitter. Emily took a deep breath, her eyes never leaving theirs. "If you can't respect my choice, then there's nothing left to discuss." She gestured to the door, and after a moment of tense silence, they turned and left, the door clicking shut behind them. It was the end of an era of strained attempts at acceptance and the beginning of a clearer, stronger stand for the family Emily and I had built together. It wasn't long after that confrontation that Richard and Linda made their final, desperate attempt to regain control. One Sunday morning, when the air outside still clung to the chill of early spring, the doorbell rang unexpectedly. I glanced at Emily, who was curled up on the couch reading, and she sighed, setting her book down. "Let me guess," she said tiredly. "Them again." I nodded and opened the door. Richard and Linda stood there, their postures rigid. They stepped inside without waiting for permission, brushing past me with an air of entitlement that set my teeth on edge. "We need to talk to our daughter," Richard announced, his eyes narrowing as he glanced at me. His tone was curt, like this was a business meeting and not an intrusion into our home. Emily stood up, folding her arms across her chest. "If you're here to tell me who I should respect or love, you can leave right now," she said, her voice firm. Linda's face tightened. "Emily, this attitude of yours is unacceptable. We raised you better than this. No, Mom. You raised me to meet your standards, to fit into your image of perfection. But I'm done playing that part, Emily retorted, the exhaustion in her eyes replaced with defiance. Richard took a step forward, eyes cold. You're throwing away your family, your legacy, for what? He pointed at me, his voice sharp with accusation. Do you have any idea how much we've sacrificed for you? Emily's voice dropped to a whisper, trembling but resolute. You sacrificed for your own pride, Dad. Not for me. You wanted me to fit your mold, to marry someone who could enhance your status. And when I didn't, you tried to make sure I'd never forget who held the power. I could feel the muscles in my jaw tense as Richard's gaze turned to me. You're the one who pushed her into this, aren't you? Poisoning her mind against us, making her think you're all she needs. I took a deep breath, steadying myself before replying. I didn't push Emily into anything. She's stronger and wiser than you give her credit for. This isn't about me, Richard. This is about how you've tried to control her, and how she's finally stepping out of that shadow. Linda's eyes filled with unshed tears, but her expression remained hardened. We did everything for you, Emily. We were there when he was barely scraping by, when we helped with those payments to keep you afloat, she said, her voice catching. And this is how you repay us? Emily shook her head, her eyes glistening. You keep saying that as if we were helpless without you. We weren't. I supported Alex because I believed in him, and he proved me right. You didn't save us. You used every bit of help to remind us who was in charge. Richard's voice turned harsh. If you can't see that this man has torn this family apart, then I don't know who you are anymore, Emily. Silence stretched out like a wire pulled too tight, ready to snap. Emily stood tall, her shoulders squared. Then maybe you never did. If you can't accept that this is my life and Alex is my husband, then we're done here. The air crackled with unspoken words, and Linda turned, her face pale. Richard followed, but not before he cast one last, venomous look at me. You'll regret this, he whispered. As the door closed behind them, Emily and I stood in the silence they left behind. She turned to me, a shaky smile breaking through the tension. I meant every word, she said, her voice softer now. I pulled her into my arms, feeling the weight of the years lift. I know, I whispered, pressing a kiss to her forehead. And so did I. We both knew that what came next wouldn't be easy, but it would be ours, free from the control of people who didn't understand the strength of the love we'd fought so hard to defend. The house felt different after that final encounter, quieter, but also freer. The ties that had bound us to Richard and Linda's influence were finally severed, leaving space for the life Emily and I wanted to build. We had come to terms with the fact that acceptance from them would never come, and we were done seeking it. It was time to close the chapter for good. A week after the confrontation, Emily and I sat at the dining room table, a checkbook open between us. We debated the decision for days, but in the end, the choice felt right. We would send Richard and Linda a check reimbursing every penny they'd ever claimed as support, so they could no longer hold it over us. Emily tapped the pen thoughtfully against her chin. This is it, isn't it? She said, looking up at me. There was a mix of sadness and relief in her eyes. I nodded, watching as she signed the check with deliberate care. It is, and once we send this, there's no turning back. A small smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. Good, she whispered. The next day, we mailed the check and blocked their contacts. It was a strange feeling, like stepping into a new world. There were moments when guilt tried to creep in, when memories of holiday dinners and shared family milestones threatened to pull us back. But we stayed strong, leaning on each other as we moved forward. One evening, we sat in the living room, the warm glow of a fire crackling in the hearth. Our son, a toddler now, was babbling as he played with his building blocks, oblivious to the weight of what we'd just done. Emily reached over and took my hand, squeezing it gently. They tried to pressure me again today, she said softly. I raised an eyebrow, concern flickering across my face. Who? Richard and Linda. She nodded, but there was no sadness, just resolve. They called from a different number. I didn't pick up, but they left a message. Same story, trying to convince me that we're making a mistake. I felt a flash of anger, but it faded as I looked at our son, then at Emily, who was watching me with a smile that said she wasn't worried. "I'm proud of us," I said, my voice steady. "Me too," she replied, turning to watch our son stack his blocks with concentration. "They'll never understand why we did this, but that's okay." The next months were challenging as we adjusted to the absence of her parents in our lives. There were awkward run-ins at community events, cold stares from extended family who had taken sides, and whispers that reached our ears. But through it all, Emily and I were united, a fortress against the noise. One day, as the sun set and painted the room in a warm, golden light, Emily came up behind me and wrapped her arms around my waist. "Do you think we'll ever regret cutting them out?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I turned to face her, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "We'll miss what we wanted them to be," I said, "but not what they were." She nodded, tears shimmering in her eyes, but not falling. "Thank you for fighting for us." "Always," I said, pulling her close. Our life moved on. Difficult at times, beautiful at others, but always our own. We learned that peace doesn't always come from outside acceptance. Sometimes it's built within, piece by piece, until it's strong enough to withstand anything. And in that quiet, fierce love, we found everything we needed.